I am Lamia Kamal Shawi. I'm the director of the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities in the OECD. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar for the launch of the 2022 edition of the OECD flagship publication, Tourism Trends and Policies. Let me show you the cover of this big fat book. Actually, it's very heavy. A lot has happened since our last edition in March 2020. We now stand at the intersection of two shocks, which have ended 60 years of almost uninterrupted growth in the sector. First, the COVID-19 pandemic, which brought tourism to a near standstill in many countries, almost all countries around the world. Before the pandemic, we have to remember that tourism directly contributed almost 4.5% of GDP and nearly 7% of employment in OECD countries. This is an average, these are averages actually, along with a fifth of service export, 25%. In some OECD economies, such as Iceland, Mexico, and Portugal, it contributes as much as 8% of GDP, and this is before the significant indirect impact of tourism are taken into account. This shows the vital role tourism plays as a driver of economic prosperity, jobs, income, and well-being as well. Yet, remember that travel restrictions in 2020 meant countries welcome 1 billion fewer international arrivals than in the previous year, with domestic tourism, which made up 3/4 of tourism expenditures before the pandemic, also very hard hit. And this shock led the direct contribution of tourism to GDP to fall by nearly 2 percentage points in 2020. And in fact, we have a data which shows that tourism accounted for 77 cents of every US dollar of lost revenue from the decline in service exports in OECD countries. And we had like destinations that were really heavily reliant on the tourism, that were particularly hard hit, including for instance, Greece's Ionian Islands and Spain's Balearic Islands. So we have even many more examples of other regions in many countries that were really severely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic crisis and the lockdown. Unprecedented government support helped tourism businesses and workers weather the storm as the sector remained closed for long periods. We always used to say was the first to shut down and the first and the last to reopen. And the earlier recovery of domestic tourism provided a lifeline, but the support did not reach or retain all workers, and many businesses have faced labor shortages as the sector reopened, and we are still suffering from that. International tourism bounced back strongly in 2022 in many countries on the back of pent-up demand and strong household savings. And indeed, tourism has performed ahead of expectations in many countries this year, and international arrivals in countries like Denmark, Greece, Portugal, and Spain, actually they returned or exceeded even summer 2019 levels. But there is a but, the recovery have been quite uneven. International tourist flows in July 2022 were still almost 20% below July 2019, with activity particularly weak in OECD countries in the Asia Pacific regions, where tourist arrivals were at least 40% lower than in 2019. And of course, the sector is now navigating another huge shock weighed down by the fallout from Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Globally, the energy price shock has increased the cost of travel. jet fuel prices surged in early 2022 and peaked at almost double pre-pandemic prices in April and June 2022. And that shock is now feeding through into broader inflation and tightening monetary policy, raising uncertainty and squeezing households' budgets, again putting holiday plans at risk in many countries. We have seen a slower recovery in OECD countries neighboring Russia and Ukraine, where in most countries, tourist numbers remain at least 30% below pre-pandemic levels in July 2022. And of course, there remain uncertainty about when tourists will return from China, which remain closed, and this will all set back the recovery. Our new survey for this particular publication, which cover all OECD countries, shows a third do not now expect international tourism to fully recover until 2025 or beyond. So, you know, the prospect is really mixed. And as governments and businesses look to support the recovery, there is a risk that efforts to create a stronger, more sustainable tourism economy will stall. And this publication, the OECD Tourism Trends and Policy 2022 edition, provides, you will find there, an overview of latest developments and key recommendations to help us optimize the strength and quality of the recovery in the particular context that I have just described. Let me now highlight just 3 key messages from this report. The first one is that we should recognize and build on the success of collaborative approaches to respond to the crisis. The scale of the crisis facing the sector was actually a powerful mobilizing force, something that if we need to find a positive aspect of the crisis, governments around the world, they created new ways to engage with the sector and to provide crucial support. And during the pandemic, we saw countries forming high-level working group, national tourism task force and advisory board, which brought together decision makers from across government and the private sector to develop responses, measures, and recovery plan. And these mechanisms that were quite powerful to help the policy response, these mechanisms should be maintained as we seek to reorient the sector to a more resilient, more sustainable model. So governments should really look at this mechanism and consolidate them instead of dissolving them. Second, we need to rebuild a tourism sector that is more resilient and better prepared for future shocks. The pandemic and the fallout from Russia's war in Ukraine has exposed, of course, new weaknesses in the sector, including a lack of diversification, the fragility of the SME, small, medium-sized enterprises, which make up, we have to remember, 85% of the sector, as well as many other challenges in, for instance, in attracting and training the sector workforce. We need to build resilience in all areas of the complex tourism system, businesses, destination, consumers, and government. And for example, the SMEs, the small and medium-sized enterprises, need access to finance and capacity building to promote innovation, develop sustainable tourism products, invest in digital tools, and ensure workers have the skills to use them. Destinations, they need to diversify the tourism offer, attract new markets, and better manage tourism to balance the impact and benefit from tourism. And tailor destination management approaches should be flexible and aligned with the national tourism strategy to build a stronger tourism ecosystem. A third recommendation is that urgent action is needed to promote a green tourism economy. We need to speed up the efforts to reduce the environmental impact and carbon emissions from tourism if the sector is to play its part in the green recovery. Recent estimates suggest that tourism contributes around 8 to 11 of global greenhouse gas emissions. It also generates pollution, uses natural resources, and impacts on the very same natural environment that actually attracts visitors. Governments need to promote carbon literacy and build capacity to develop innovative solutions. And this includes informing travelers and businesses about their carbon footprint and options to reduce it. They can lead government by example by ensuring, for instance, that publicly funded or procured tourism infrastructure contribute to improve environmental outcome. So this report, these are some of the recommendations that I mentioned. You know, they are very quite generic, but in the report you can find a lot of examples of what countries are doing. The report we are launching today actually is a collaborative effort between the OECD, member and partner countries, and the European Union. And I'm really delighted today to be joined by Hubert Gams, who is a Deputy Director General of DG GROW. Hubert, I would like to thank you and the European Commission for your excellent cooperation in the preparation of the report. I'm going to stop here because we're going to hear from Mr. Hubert Gams. He's going to provide us with some perspective on the report, insight on the recovery outlook and priorities in Europe. Please, this is the floor is yours, Hubert.
Thank you. Good morning, good evening to the colleagues in New Zealand. Dear Lamia, dear Minister Nash, dear colleagues, thank you for having me here. And before turning to the EU efforts to support the tourism ecosystem, I would like to say a few words about our long and fruitful cooperation with the OECD Tourism Committee. The objective of the first EU grant that was given to support the first OECD biannual report on tourism trends and policies, released at the beginning of 2008. That report focused on economic challenges for developed economies to remain competitive in the global tourism market, and how governments could help tourism small and medium-sized enterprises to operate in global value chains. This SME angle proved very useful when the financial crisis hit the world at the end of 2008, before it turned actually into a global economic crisis that affected domestic and international tourism. Then a few years later, when several OECD countries became the target of major terrorist attacks between 2015 and 2017, the Tourism Committee accepted to organize, at the request of the European Union, many informal meetings, because we wanted to look together at how to better prevent attacks against tourism assets and how to minimize their impact. The added value of the committee and the need to support its work are very evident to me. Now, the 2022 report looks at new global challenges: the COVID pandemic, the impact of the Russian war against Ukraine. And Lamia, you mentioned several of these challenges that we are facing in the tourism sector. And the aim of this enumeration is not to depress the audience and the important tourism industry. It should just serve us as a reminder that the tourism ecosystem is particularly exposed to natural disasters, to economic crisis, to health-related shocks, and to security threats. And it is also a reminder that we all need more data, more analysis, more forecasting, and more recommendations to become more resilient. The OECD is an environment where democratic countries with advanced economies can benchmark their tourism policies and learn from each other. And this is also why a number of EU member states are using funds from the Recovery and Resilience Facility to get the OECD to receive technical support to implement reforms in the tourism sector. And I would like to mention a few things that the European Union has been doing lately for the recovery of tourism, or shall I say, to rebuild it better. We are working at many levels. Travel facilitation at EU external borders with the digitalization of visa procedures. The restoration of the free movement of people within the Schengen area, thanks to the EU digital COVID certificate. The revision of travelers' rights. The review of VAT regimes. New rules on short-term rentals. And mobility and multimodal ticketing, to mention just a few examples. As it has been recommended by the OECD, we have decided to go beyond this whole of government approach. Our idea has been and is to gather around the table all shareholders in an, may I say, almost unprecedented co-creation process. This has led to the release in February of this year of the Tourism Transition Pathway. This document identifies 70 specific actions in 27 areas with clearly defined objectives. And as of October, more than 260 pledges have been collected and published on the European website. And they come from member states of the European Union, regions, but many, many stakeholders in the tourism sector. Because the European Commission has invited the member states to step up our joint efforts. And this has also now come together in a new EU agenda for tourism. This agenda was adopted very recently on the 1st of December by the Council of the European Union. After a lot of preparatory work had been done during successive presidencies of the Council of the European Union, with countries like Portugal, Slovenia, France, and finally the Czech Republic in charge. And this is almost emblematic of the collaborative approach that you, Lamia, and the 2022 report set out very clearly. You mentioned three key messages: collaboration, resilience, and green tourism. And with the transition pathway and the new EU agenda for tourism, we exactly intend to speed up the green and also the digital transition of tourism in Europe and to contribute to solving the climate crisis while preserving a very important social acquis: the right to discover others and the right to discover the world. Thank you very much, and I wish you fruitful discussions today in the webinar.
Thank you so much, Hubert. Indeed, we are very proud of this long-standing collaboration with DG GROW, the European Commission, all the things that we have been doing together for so many years, especially to produce this report. And you mentioned now that we are even engaged in providing technical support in some EU countries. We are very happy to do that. You also mentioned the importance to engage with different shareholders, stakeholders. In the OECD, we're also doing that through the Global Forum on Tourism, and we need to continue to join forces because this is essential. I'm very happy now that we are joined by a representative from another region outside Europe, Asia Pacific. We have with us Minister Stuart Nash, Minister for Economic and Regional Development, Tourism, Small Business and Forestry in New Zealand. We are extremely grateful to him. I think it's 11 p.m., 11:30 p.m. in New Zealand. And as usual, Stuart Nash is with us. He's our champion and our great friend. The floor is yours, Minister Nash.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. Bonjour from New Zealand. Actually, I'm in a hotel in Queenstown, one of New Zealand's most beautiful tourism towns. And it was a bit of a ghost town for 2 years, but now once again, a thriving holiday resort full of people with foreign accents. It's a pleasure to be able to join you online today. Thank you to the OECD for inviting me to speak. Thanks to Lamia, Hubert for your insightful comments, and to the panel speakers still to come for joining the discussion. I was fortunate to be in Paris recently, where I met with many OECD colleagues, and the work of the OECD and the discussions I have when visiting are always invaluable and inspiring. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to join again to acknowledge the important contributions of the OECD to tourism. For New Zealand, the launch of the OECD Tourism Trends and Policies 2022 is timely. Like many nations, we are having to rebuild and reframe our tourism industry in a post-COVID world. And the emphasis has unashamedly moved from numbers to quality. And my vision is that New Zealand is one of the top 3 aspirational destinations for the world's most discerning travellers. My aspiration and ambition is that people arrive as tourists and leave as storytellers. To your point, Lamia, before COVID, tourism was New Zealand's largest export industry and employed 8% of our workforce. With our, quote, health response as the best economic response, end quote, to the management of COVID, which meant our borders were closed for 2 years, international visitor arrivals decreased by 98.6%. And those employed in the industry decreased by about a third. And many of our international destinations that had a significant economic reliance on global travellers were hit incredibly hard. In fact, the tourism sector of our economy received more direct financial support than any other sector. But now, as international visitors return, there are certainly obstacles to recovery. And like many OECD countries, the New Zealand tourism industry is focused on rebuilding its workforce. And of course, the global situation, as you mentioned, Lamia, still remains uncertain, which may delay the international travel plans of many, especially to a distant location like New Zealand. Our recovery is not just about economic performance, and certainly not just about visitor numbers. It's about implementing a regenerative tourism model that tells an engaging story and provides a compelling value proposition to all direct and indirect stakeholders. And by that, I mean communities, our local Indigenous Māori population, as well as those who work in the industry. What the pandemic also provided is an opportunity to take stock and address some of the long-standing issues in the industry. For example, we are now addressing the structural workforce and environmental concerns with an aim of creating a more regenerative and resilient tourism sector, as well as more resilient communities in towns that rely on tourism. We've put together something called an Industry Tourism Transformation Plan, or an ITP, where we are working in partnership with the government, with industry, with unions, with workers, and Indigenous Māori to create solutions that have buy-in from all and directly address the issues identified by the industry itself. And the first phase of the ITP focuses on the workforce. And it aims to address the perception of work in tourism, that being its low wages, long hours, and uncertainty. And we want to move that perception to one of aspiration, fulfillment, and attractive, sustainable career pathways. Through this phase, the ITP partners have produced a Tourism Better Workforce Action Plan and a set of concrete actions ranging from education to innovation and technology. The second phase of the ITP, we are working on strategies to ensure that the tourism industry has a positive impact on the environment, i.e. it's regenerative rather than extractive. We expect that visitors are going to become increasingly concerned about the environmental impact of their tourism. And so as a country that at least a long-haul flight for many of our key markets, we need to mitigate the risk of carbon miles becoming a deciding factor in traveling. So first of all, it's imperative and really important that we preserve our environment, acknowledging that it's one of the key reasons why people actually visit New Zealand. This means living the 100% pure brand through reducing emissions, adapting to climate change, and ensuring we maximize every opportunity to enhance the environment in a way that also enhances our social license to operate across our diverse communities. And indirectly through my forestry and economic development portfolios, we're looking at biofuel alternatives to avgas. On that note, I would like New Zealand to join other OECD members in leading the way as a regenerative, sustainable tourism destination. Lamia, I know there are a number of countries across the OECD grappling with similar challenges and looking for ways to rebuild the industry back in a more resilient and regenerative manner. This is why the OECD Trends and Policies document is so vital. It allows us to learn from one another, to collaborate, and to innovate. It tells me that we are all trying to solve similar problems around the environmental impact of tourism, and that there are a number of innovative case studies that highlight the breadth of the challenge. I want to thank again the OECD and all contributors to the report for their efforts. After a challenging testing and unprecedented 2.5 years, when we are trying to reset, recover, and return to business, this document marks an important moment, and as per usual, is a wonderful resource for all of our economies. We will be able to retain and reflect on the lessons we've learned over this time and continue to build the resilience of our industry for any future shocks. New Zealand continues to see immense value in the OECD leadership in tourism, as in every other areas of economic policy. Thank you once again, Lamia, for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today, and I wish you all the best for your discussions. Kia ora, kia kaha, from New Zealand.
Thank you so much, Minister Nash. The word that I will take from your intervention is that really you always make sure that everything you do is good for people, is good for communities, and this is what the tourism sector should be about. Thank you so much again for being with us. It was very late and generous, and let's continue to exchange on the best practices from around the world. Now we are going to move to a panel that is going to be about navigating the tourism recovery to shape a stronger, more sustainable future. Before I hand over to the moderator, I just want to say a word and thanks the team, especially Celine Kaufman and Jane Stacy. Thank you so much. Jane is going to make some concluding remarks. And now I'm going to hand over to Sergio Guerrero, who is the chair of the OECD Tourism Committee that is now really recognized as one of the very, very successful committee. And this is greatly because of the very strong leadership of Sergio. Sergio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lamia, and well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone that is following us. First of all, I want to thank the OECD for inviting me to participate in this session. Also, would like to congratulate the OECD Secretariat for the report, which covers this last 2 years of really challenging times to our industry. This publication really gives a comprehensive overview of the tourism policies undertook in this period and provides a robust collection of data among OECD countries and also other relevant tourism economies. In this panel, we'll be talking about navigating the tourism recovery to shape a stronger and more sustainable view. A little bit of notes on my side. Navigating, because after 2 years of strong challenges brought by the pandemic, the tourism industry is facing now the impacts of the Russia war in Ukraine, the rise of inflation, the economic slowdown, which might affect the tourism recovery. Uncertainty is here to stay. And what the future will look like is probably the question in everyone's minds around the table. Second point on stronger and more sustainable future. But actually, these 2 years brought us some important takeaways. It was an important reminder of the vital role that tourism play as a driver of economic prosperity, jobs, and well-being. We've been discussing too many tourists. We had the opportunity to understand what it means to have no tourists for 2 years. So very, very important takeaway. The second one is the recovery process was or is uneven. And that also brings the risk of inequality throughout countries and regions, and is something that tourism policy should tackle. Third point, the pandemic accelerated the need to a digital and green transition, of the industry, and we also have to acknowledge that there is a lot to do within this regard. With strong recovery, old challenges are back, namely pressure on destinations and local communities. On top of this, the pandemic has brought serious challenges in terms of tourism workforce, as been mentioned, and the loss of attractiveness of the industry for new talent, especially in most developed countries. For governments, an additional challenge, the need to balance short-term, sometimes survival measures with long-term vision towards sustainability and the need to prepare the industry for future shocks. This is the background for the next panel, and I'll have the pleasure to moderate three excellent speakers, which I'm going to introduce briefly. We have Ede Tainbas, counselor from the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communication from Estonia. Hi, Ede. We have Peter Lochbichler, global head of public affairs at booking.com. And we have Stefan Achtman, a futurist head of European Tourism Futures Institute. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. My first question goes to is the same for all panelists, is from your perspective, what's the outlook for tourism for the next year? And what are the main challenges and opportunities for the recovery? And perhaps I would start with Ede.
Hello, good morning to everyone, or afternoon or evening. Well, coming to your question, Sergio, I think if I would want to answer this with full confidence, I could also participate in a psychic or fortune teller TV show, but as this is not the case, I can only guess. And I would hope to say that that we could witness some sort of stability in tourism sector for next year. But well, last year's shocks, starting with COVID, followed by Russian war in Ukraine, and the associated increase in input prices and tensions in labor markets and flight sector. Yeah, well, maybe it is more wise not to hope for stability, but prepare for the continuing instability. And it is certainly a challenge, but I think that every challenge includes an opportunity to learn and change. And it seems to me that during these last years in tourism sector, we have been forced to learn and change. And at least in Estonia, we have worked out the first steps in the process of increasing the resilience of the tourism sector, which has been, like in other countries, growing constantly in last decades. And when reading this newly published study, I see that many other countries have taken the similar steps. For example, just to mention some, communication and cooperation between public and private sector has increased a lot. When before the crisis, state acted more of as a regulator or controller, we now have shifted our mindset and want to be partner for the sector. And second example is, of course, that we have to pay more and more attention to data and studies and impact assessments, what we are doing now in big amount to really know where we stand for the knowledge-based decision making. And moving on logically from data, for timely data, we know that we need that digitalization is a prerequisite. So digitalization and steps towards real-time economy and tourism sector are much needed. And of course, another great challenge certainly lies in increasing input prices and insufficiency of labor market. But I think this can also be taken as an opportunity to kind of forcefully change to resource efficiency. And that in turn will also be useful for communities and environment of destinations. And that actually increases the resilience and the sustainability of tourism sector, because we know that this environment and these communities are actually the travel motivations why people travel for. So I think this is briefly the main things I wanted to bring out.
Thank you, Ede. And now we move to Peter.
Thank you, Sergio, and hello everyone, and thanks for having me on the panel today. I'd like to answer your question from two perspectives, if I may. The first one is from the booking.com perspective, sharing a few numbers, what we see at an aggregate level. But then secondly, and more importantly, also what we hear from our partners, accommodations around Europe. And as you said, Sergio, after two extremely challenging years, 2020, 2021, with lockdowns and travel restrictions, I think in 2022, we have seen, hopefully, I say that with some caution, but hopefully the light of the end of the tunnel in terms of the COVID pandemic. There was a lot of talk about a record summer 2022. When I say summer, I'm saying that from a kind of Northern European perspective here. And this is what we have seen. We only had our earnings call a few weeks ago, so that's why I can share some very recent numbers. We have seen growth in the third quarter compared to 2019 levels, importantly. So we have seen higher numbers of room nights in most parts of the world, with Asia still lagging. But I think also there, glint of hope, looking at October more specifically, we actually see all regions around the world above 2019 levels. So that is good. That's positive for the sector. And looking into Q1 of next year, we also basically go optimistic into that year. We see good booking levels. We see healthy growth over 2019 levels. If I flip that, we are actually coincidentally only today, parallel to this, where we're now launching an accommodation barometer that we have done with Statista, which is a data gathering company. So please look it up if you're interested. And this is a survey with a European focus, to be clear, among 1,000 managers of accommodations across 9 countries in Europe. And just a very high level summary, what we see there is what I would call cautious optimism, with the key challenges, the top 3 challenges that are being mentioned by those people managing hotels and accommodations across Europe. Number 1, very, very clearly in Europe, the rise in energy costs. 80% of property managers mention that as the single biggest challenge that they're facing, followed by the overall uncertainty and macroeconomic environment with inflation and fears of recession. And thirdly, then staffing, attracting and also retaining staff. And we might come back on that later, I believe. And just to finish off in terms of other challenges, the twin transition. Actually, properties feel well prepared, it seems. We hear on digital transformation, around 60% feel well prepared. And even on sustainability, 39% are cautiously optimistic that they can manage that. I leave it there because we have limited time, but happy to come back on any of this later.
Thank you very much, Peter. Now we move to Stefan. Stefan, we're living a period of disruption, which much more uncertainty ahead and more impact ahead also. How do you foresee the tourism policies in the future to deal with these scenarios of uncertainty? How can destinations balance between short-term survival mode and long-term strategic thinking? And have you seen lessons from these 2 period years that can actually tackle the tourism policies for the future? I know too many questions, but I hope that the futurists can help us.
A lot of questions and relevant questions. So first of all, good morning to everyone, and thanks for having me on this panel as well. Yeah, I think disruptions. I think we will see much more in the near future. Of course, we have been facing disruptions, and of course there are, I think, more to come related to climate change, climate adaptation. Think about energy transitions, biodiversity, also in the agricultural domain. For urbanization, there's so much, I think, going to affect destination development, how our destinations look like and how they are perceived by visitors. I think there's so much more in terms of impacts that on the one hand can be disruptive and on the other hand can also be enablers for further development. And I think that's something we need to be aware of, that they have both 2 sides. At the same time, it's going to be challenging, particularly I think with recovery. That will most likely, I guess, happen. But at the same time, I think we should be aware that we will see people who benefit but also not benefit the haves and the have-nots. I think that's something that we should be aware about, and even distribution that was also already mentioned. I think that's really important to take into account. And if you move to tourism policies, of course, it's about enhancing resilience, but also capacity building of those that need to do this. I think that's really, really important to develop those. I think in the report it's referred to as governance systems, to build those that are effective and that operate well, and to, of course, mobilize the resources to do this, to build this, but also to implement policies that I think are created in co-creation. But I think this is important to do, and at the same time, we should look beyond tourism. I think also look at how to connect to those other transitions in society, like energy, like biodiversity, and see where can you actually find those, those connections. Because I think before you know it, those discussions are bigger than tourism. And how do you actually connect? So maybe that's also in the strategic long-term thinking, knowing that the short-term situation is, of course, how do you survive? How do you pay your energy costs? And that's going to be very tricky. But at the same time, I think the lessons from earlier crises, that's also what you asked, if I'm correct. I think we've seen quick responses where the right stakeholders at the right time created short lines and were action oriented. I think that's something we should keep in the back of our minds, that we're focused. And I think at this moment, if we talk about recovery, it's really a question about, do we basically go back to business as usual? Do we bounce back? Do we actually bring industry forward? Do we bounce forward? And I think then, what are the right goals? What are the right ambitions that we have? Because if we are not careful, before we know it, we talk about over-tourism and we talk about negative impacts. And we're back at the discussion 3 to 4 years ago. And I think it's going to be important to, how do we keep the social license to operate for tourism? How do we balance the quality of life, of the inhabitants, the quality of work of people and entrepreneurs, but also the quality of the experience of the visitors? And how do you actually balance those? And I think that's, we should monitor, I think, to connect to data. When do we see the overshoots, when it's off balance, and when do we see the shortfalls, when we are also again out of balance? I think that's going to be our challenge in the next years, and I think that needs to get policy attention.
Thank you, Stefan. Today's my day for making difficult questions. So labor and skill shortages actually remain, as also Peter also mentioned, as one of the most important challenges that industry is facing these days. In your opinion, what would be the number one thing that governments or businesses should do to address this ongoing labor challenge? And now back to Ede.
Yes, well, as in other countries, also the tourism sector in Estonia, one of the biggest problems we witness now is the skills and labor shortages, and we deal with this really every day. And actually, I think it consists, at least for us in Estonia, we have thought out that it has like two sides. One is education and another is labor market. So we have to work with both together. But of course, the answer in both cases is more flexible policies. For example, in education in Estonia, now we have it is the vocational standard. And on that, there is built the national curriculum. And on that, there is built the curriculums of the vocational schools, for example. And now the kids who go to school next autumn, based on all these documents, they will come out of schools after 3 years. And by that time, these skills are not the ones that the labor market is needing anymore. So there is, of course, the need more quickly to train and retrain tourist employees. And actually, I see that the water has started moving, so processes are getting faster. And Ministry of Education is giving more trust to schools and is encouraging their cooperation with employees. For example, the micro qualifications and all studying in companies and the more practices in companies. These are the opportunities to change the education. And of course, when talking about the labor legislation, here again, I know that the labor legislation is meant to protect the employees, but at the same time, we see that also employees now want more short-term, flexible, rotating, variable hour contracts. They want to sell their services, or they want to work in several places together to increase their development. So of course, also the labor legislation should follow that. And for example, and also taking the case of Estonia, where we have now received about 5% of our population are Ukrainian refugees now. We have to facilitate their access to a labor market. And of course, they have a right now to go to work in companies, but there are needed the language courses or East language requirements also in tourism sector. So these are the things that we work on a daily basis here.
Thank you, Ede. Very, I would say, very comprehensive and very nice and very tough questions to actually tackle. Now we move to Peter.
On the same question, Sergio?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So we are a platform, obviously, bringing together the travelers and the businesses. We are not operating the hotels, but we work closely with our partners. So what we try to do as Booking.com is provide training on the digital transition, but also on the green transition, provide information. I think it's an issue that is also not the issue of labor shortage is not an issue that is only relevant for the tourism sector. I think I remember the stories at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, where there was a shortage of security staff, and then the airport decided to pay a bonus for the peak season and the summer months. But immediately once that bonus had expired, people also moved on to other jobs. So I think it's a general issue of how to keep those important roles attractive, and some of them are in the lower skilled area, if we are honest. So keep that attractive, but I think it has covered that a lot from a government perspective.
Thank you, Peter. Now we move to Stefan.
Yeah, I think it's a really important topic. Well, in the region where I'm from, the Netherlands, it's of course the same as elsewhere. I think what we see is that we see also different stakeholders come together. And for instance, we have an initiative, it's called the Hospitality Pact, where we see education and also different organizations joining forces and try to find solutions, because it's a big issue. And I think what is important is also how to make the industry attractive. And I think then we have, of course, a couple of years of negative experience where you see it's a volatile type of industry. And if this is this an industry that you see yourself in as a young person? Is it kind of a comfortable industry to work in? I think then that's of course about image that needs to be solved. I think that's important from a policy and maybe government perspective. There's often a discussion on labor productivity, so where to invest your money in. So it's labor productivity in the sense of earnings per full-time position, and then in tourism or recreation or leisure, it's relatively low compared to government jobs or R&D jobs, and often in many cases that's a factor in decision making. So if as a government you want to spend your money where you get your return on investment, it might not be tourism, it might be something else, it might be the high-end type of jobs. Well, those are important for the economy, but let's also take into account the social side of tourism and its effect on well-being. And then I think that's something that might be relevant for governments also to broaden that perspective and not only focus maybe too much on labor productivity, but this is a really important, but also very highly political choice to do so. But I think that's something you can actually take into account.
Thank you, Stefan. I think we in this topic of labor shortages, we could be talking for hours, and I believe probably the OECD could do some work on this and gather the community. I think it's something that we are trying. But I was listening to the speakers, and actually collaboration between education and the tourism sector today is critical. How can we accelerate actually the capacity building and learning? We're almost in all questions were mentioned as very important topics. And here I say again, do not work alone. Do partnerships between the public and the private sector, especially between governments and businesses, because life on the main street for businesses is changing in a very, very speedy way, and governments also need to get in touch and understand what those changes mean actually for policies, but also for training, for all the elements of that. But perhaps more flexibility can be a topic. I just wanted to remind our participants that we have a Q&A, and we're going to open it in 5 minutes for questions. So feel free to jump in with questions. I have one extra before opening the floor to participants, which is one that I really like very much, which is connected to data. Actually, today we're living in a world of accelerated digitalization of processes, with platforms playing an important role in the development of the country, of businesses. My question is, are we doing enough in terms of using the data that is available for promoting better policies? Ed, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, well, certainly we are not doing enough. There is abundance of data available, and we use only a fraction of this. It's like the ratio with brain. I think we have. I think with the statistics were that we were using 20% of this or something like this. All right, but it is really a difficult question, because there is different type of data, and some are like the official data used by statistical offices, and then there are the experimental data, and when you want to combine them, then there is the overlapping, or there are some gray areas. So of course we need more timely, reliable, and available data for knowledge-based decision making. But we have to figure out how to put all these different data together, and of course we have to bear in mind also the data protection, that all this data that we use is also respecting the rights of those who are giving this out. In Estonia we now try to include more this experimental data, like credit card payments or mobile positioning, or even analyzing the conversations of social media for knowledge-based decision making. But I think it is also this question that there is a right of the data providers also to use this data in their interest. So we also have to see how we can make this data, for example, when the SMEs are giving to us, give this back to them, that they could also make the right decisions, and also add the correct analysis to this, because data without interpretation could turn us into totally wrong direction. But I think in every conversation that we have now about our plans or decision making is the question of data, and if this is reliable, and where should we turn. So I think now we have the at least one bigger solution is that we are trying to work out a special tourism sector data strategy for our country. And I hope I can find from this report some great examples from the OECD 2022 study on how to make contact with other countries to learn from them.
Thank you, Ede. We also count on the working party on tourism statistics that works together with the OECD Tourism Committee to actually speed up the data agenda for the sector. Now we move to probably the one that has more data about the tourism sector, which is Peter. So is the sector using correctly the data that it's available? And I would say both the government side and statistics office side, but also and especially the businesses around.
And yeah, thanks for that distinction, which I believe is crucial. And I think Ede touched on an important point, that I always get a little nervous when we say, kind of, if there's a belief we only need to hand over vast amounts of data, and that in itself will kind of solve challenges of small business, because I don't think this is the way. So I think first, indeed, we need to distinguish what kind of data is useful for policymakers, for governments. And I'll just mention one example here. We engaged in a partnership with Eurostat, the EU Statistics Office, where we and some of our competitors in the market hand over very granular and also very sensitive, I'd like to emphasize that, data on short-term rentals in particular. We do that because this is based on trust and a protocol with Eurostat, where we know they will aggregate and deal with the data in a way that it does not have any business sensitive implications. That's one example, and for sure there's more that can be done in that area. When it comes to the businesses, kind of what is useful for, in particular, SMEs, I prefer to speak of insights rather than data. So what is actionable, what helps them to adjust their marketing strategies, have overview about their source markets. And this is what we do pretty much day to day with our offices around the world, working with partners to help them grow their business, have incremental growth. We have comparison data in their destination. So I think that there's a lot that can be done in that area, but I prefer to be quite concrete and not build a myth like data solves everything, because I don't think that is the case.
Thank you, Peter. Tend to agree, based on my experience, actually. Too much data is not a better avenue for decision making. But very good point. Now we move to Stefan.
Yeah, I think I can definitely agree to that. I think data is a means, and I think you need to really get information that matters. But it will be very different per destination, what type of information you actually need. I think that might be a challenge. I think the example that Peter just gave at EU level, I think it's really an inspiring one. But I think also at like local and regional levels, that's quite hard to do, because there are also smaller businesses that collect a lot of data. But how do you combine that with data from governments, for instance, or universities, or you name it? It takes time, it takes capacity, it takes intellectual qualities to do all of that. And I think that's where you also need to do capacity building to become smart tourism destinations. Of course, the EU is taking that into account. There is a program on smart tourism destinations. So there are ways to actually exchange perspectives, change approaches, because indeed there is a lot of data there present, but not used. Sometimes it's with private industries and not accessible by the governments, for instance. So how then we come back, I think, to the governance issue. How do we actually do that? Because you have best practices. Do we have maybe kind of white label approaches to that? Because I think there's a lot of inventing or reinventing the wheel taking place. How do we avoid this? But again, this is very time consuming, very labor intensive, resource intensive. I think that's where we need to maybe also be very strategic in what do we do and what do we do not do. For instance, we were talking about mapping overshoots and shortfalls instead of trying to find the optimal data dashboard that we can create. Basically, what we see as steering information is when is it too much? When do we have too much tourism, or when do we have too little? Just as an example, maybe from Amsterdam, I think most of you know about this, but there's a maximum limit of tourists in a local ordinance, kind of a local law, so to say. When it exceeds more than 20 million visitors, the city has to take action. When it is less than 10 million, of course, then the industry and society kind of there's not a good foundation. And also, there is more policy attention to tourism. But if it's somewhere in between, basically, then you have some like a key performance indicator that's really relevant that will turn into action. Maybe we have to be very critical towards those key performance indicators and not have indicators at large, like long lists of 400 or something, but indicators that really matter, that influence decision making at maybe political level, but also at the level of the CEOs or the company owners.
Yeah. Excellent points, and I fully agree. I think the data is, I would say, very challenging topic, but at the same time, I think another area where learning is most needed. Now, I'd like to open the floor. I think I see already a few questions. The first one is from Morocco to Peter. So greetings from Morocco. I have two questions. One is, have you noted any examples of use of international digital platforms such as Booking, TripAdvisor, or national ones for the promotion of ecotourism in rural areas?
Yes, thank you for the question. So what we see in consumer surveys that we do regularly is that there is a shift that people want to travel more consciously. Maybe that's one summary of doing it. What I mean with that is, one, on the sustainable side, we know there's a clear intention, at least from travelers, to make an effort, but we also see it happen. So I think it's not something that will go away and stay at the intention level. So sustainable travel is one part, and I think sustainable beyond the narrow environmental definition, also talking about impact on communities, have sustainable, resilient tourism. And the second part then is about overcrowdedness. As you said, Sergio, we have not had that problem in the last years, but we should also try to rebuild better. And again, what we see from surveys is a clear intent. 60% say they want to avoid overcrowded destinations, but also looking back at travel in the past 12 months, one number I see here in my notes is that 27% of those 30,000 travelers that we asked actually chose a less popular destination when they were traveling in the past 12 months. So I think that is change that is here to stay. Now, what is the role of platforms in this? I think the role has to be that we use the scale, the size, the leverage of our platform to help with that. And I think we're doing that with two ways, but I'm watching time here. On the sustainability side, we were actually just celebrating the first anniversary of a badge that we introduced a year ago at Booking.com. It's a badge that hotels and accommodations can apply for if you want to reward their sustainability efforts. And then, there's a big discussion about third-party verified labels and so on. We are working in that direction. But just to share a number, so we have, after 1 year, 400,000 properties on our page who have a travel sustainable badge, which means their efforts, their investments become visible to travelers. And if you combine then to make the efforts and investments visible, reward hotels for doing that, and at the same time allow consumers to also find those sustainable properties, I think this is where we can set a flywheel in motion, if you want, where consumer behavior and reward for investments come together. But it's still a very small part, and we need to do a lot more and also expand that to other verticals. So not only to accommodations, but obviously flights, cars are equally important. And then very last to finish on kind of dispersion of travel. Again, I think platforms can play a big role in that. We looked into the numbers a little bit, and I think overall in the market, a small part of accommodation revenue goes to rural areas only. It's like 80+%, according to my numbers, goes to city areas and a small part to rural. If we look at our inventory, the share of rural areas is a lot higher. So what that means, we can be the shop window to allow small properties also in rural, less well-off areas to become visible to tourists to make those choices.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. Perhaps I would give the floor to Ede. How can governments also be an important part of this strategy to actually take tourists to more remote or less traditional destinations?
Well, yes, I think we have also discussed that, of course, that is not in interest of, no, okay, I start from the beginning. Of course, the travelers have a big impact for environment and communities, and we have also discussed how to divide it more equally between the destinations, because it also in Estonia, which is maybe not the first destination for all the people listening here. But also here we see that the capital city, Tallinn, is taking the biggest share of tourists. And sometimes it gets in busy months really crowded. And we know that this continuous growth to selected destinations in short weeks or months of the season will not be sustainable, neither in view of the environment or community, or even the scarce resources that have to bought up for a short period of time and space. So I think the diversification of tourism by destinations and seasons is certainly an important tool to allow a more equal distribution of resources and income, and also burden on local environments and societies. And I think this also increases the customer satisfaction, because, well, nobody wants to stand in queues or fight with crowds. So what we do is, for example, every public money that we give out to tourism sector, in evaluation criteria, we always have the component of regionalism and the component of seasonality. So it's not so that in summer in Tallinn nothing gets support if it is a good project or good investment, of course. But we try to see that at least the public resources are distributed more evenly by regions. And of course, I see that also other countries, as well as Estonia, is trying to empower our DMOs, or destination management organizations, a lot. So that they would be not merely marketing organizations, but also work with product development, the digitalization, greening of the sector. So we are giving them both financing and also all the capacity building activities to make the destination stronger, so that they could attract more visitors. Yes, and of course the third thing is that we want the destinations and SMEs in regions to be more visible. So we now have supported also big projects that are run in cooperation with IT companies and tourist companies. Of course, everybody can put their information up in Booking.com or Airbnb, but also to digitalize the resource management. This is also very important. This helps them also to put their offer to all those well-known websites better. Well, yes, that was the main things.
Thank you, Ede. Great point. I think I totally agree. We are in Portugal. We are exactly in the same page. So policies matter to actually shift dispersal of tourists. So it's not just spray and pray. We have something to do as government. I don't know, Stephanie, if you have something to add to this, or should I move to the next question?
Yes, that's okay.
Okay, so I have one very short question to to Peter. Is it possible to access booking data to monitor in real time the resilience of certain localities to external shocks?
So accessing data in real time, there's, again, data is a big word. I need to say, and I can't just avoid saying that there are constraints. We are a publicly listed company. There are stock market rules of what we share, what we don't share. And of course, some of that is highly sensitive because it talks directly to our revenue, to our success. Having said all that, with all the caveats, I think an example like the Eurostat is definitely a good example. It's not real time, but I think it's analyzed at a very professional level. It's then made available in aggregate form, and we are open to more such partnerships. We're actively working on, can we put together a set of data and insights that we can make available? So it's work in progress. I just also don't want to overpromise because there are sensitivities around it.
Thank you, Peter. Question to all panelists. Do you think the lack of workers in tourism industry is due to low wages? That's a tricky one, but I think a good one, very good one. I don't know who wants to jump in. Ede? It's a tricky.
Yeah, I may start. Of course, this is also one important component. Adding or also affected by long working hours, unstable working hours, etc. But also, I think what is keeping people away from the tourism sector is also maybe this routine and not very prestige jobs that they need to do. And I think here one solution certainly can be digitalization. That will take more of these simple jobs can be digitalized, and people can do in tourism sector more versatile things that will also make them grow and learn something. And also because then their job will be a more skilled one. The employers also are ready to pay more salaries. But here in Estonia, we also can see that in tourism sector, of course, the average salary compared average salary in tourism sector compared with national average salary was further falling during COVID, and I think this is understandable, of course. But now the companies are getting stronger again, and as we really witness this labor shortages, the wages are raising as well. And I think one more thing I wanted to say, and it slipped off my mind, so I will give floor to the others.
Thank you, Adam. Perhaps I would move to Stefan to talk about, well, wages, or just raising wages is not, well, first of all, just an immediate measure that we can take from one side. Perhaps, I don't know if you want to touch about how to actually improve productivity in the industry, and probably the role of technology and stuff that can be added on that.
Exactly, I think it's a really important aspect. I mean, during COVID, I think we saw many employees leave the industry. Interestingly enough, also to, for instance, test centers that were sponsored by governments. I mean, that's something that we saw, at least in the Netherlands, that paid slightly higher than, let's say, the hospitality industry. So it was more convenient to work in test centers than in hospitality, which is interesting. So the wages, the level, definitely will have an impact. And you know, if the minimum wage is very close to the level of social benefits, then if that is a trigger sometimes not to choose for the industry. And I think we definitely have to look into that. But if you want to increase wages, it does something maybe very fundamentally to the business model of a company. You have to rethink everything. If your costs increase, and of course, you have, next to costs of wages, you have also other operational costs that are increasing at the moment. How much space do you have? How much margins do you have to actually do that? Because if you increase wages, everything will change. Your business model needs to change. You need to think about ask higher prices. But if you ask higher prices, there's more demand also in terms of the experience, for instance. And is there enough market to actually do all of that? I think that's a big tricky thing at the moment that we are in. On the one hand, we need to, because there's labor shortage. On the other hand, how much can actually the market take? How much quality or luxury tourists, or however we call them, are there actually to do all of this? But of course, time will tell. This is also an economic process, I guess, with supply and demand. We'll see. We'll have to see. But I think what is important is that we definitely look into, and also as consumers maybe pay the price that we actually may need to pay, and that might be actually higher than we are used to in order to get good quality and to keep up the industry. But that's a mind shift on the side of the consumer, but also on the side of the entrepreneur. You really have to take this into account. But maybe you have to, because otherwise you lose your employees. So it's a question of, do you have a choice, or will time tell? And if you're too late, then it's about survival of the fittest at the moment. But also the survival of those who can actually make such a change. Maybe some of them who actually dare to do this. But this is really, really important. Maybe also part of the industry, it might not be the wage only. It's also about the stability of the job and career perspectives. So is that clear? How can you actually develop a career in the industry? And is it only in hospitality, or is it also indeed in R&D, in digitalization? Is there industries connected to tourism or hospitality industry? If that's clear, you also know more about the different pathways you can actually go as an employee, which is really important for students at the moment. And it's important for education to actually tell this to the prospective students, because at the moment, I think many educational programs see a drop in student numbers. So the labor shortage, in that sense, is getting worse if we don't have inflow. So this is, again, why we have these hospitality pacts that I talked about, to actually make sure that it's about image, it's about career, but it's so much, and it's a shared responsibility. I think that's our
Yeah, absolutely. And when we have in certain top business school, top hospitality schools in the world, that half of the students go to other industries, something is has to be thought. There is one question on: do you think conferences like World for Travel or Tourism, Travel and Tourism Council conferences can make a real difference on the ground? And I would say perhaps a bit more generic question is governance in the sector evolving towards in supporting the transformation that the sector needs? I don't know who wants to pick on this. I don't know, Peter, so your head.
I'll take it. It's a big question. I mean, I think on the value of conferences, yes, I definitely do see value in coming together, and I think that's just human nature that is important. At the same time, I would also say that there is a large number of organizations and bodies, and I think we are quite fragmented, if we're honest. And you have DMOs often at regional, at local level. So I think there is something about how can we strengthen the voice as a sector. And so there was a second part to the question that I lost track, but maybe another panel.
Yeah, well, no, it was basically if the government is the governance of the sector in general evolving towards supporting the transition that is needed.
I think the themes are set, sustainability, twin transition. I think the themes are clearly set, not only in Europe, but also elsewhere. but changing consumer behavior and changing things in the sector take time. It will just not happen overnight. And I think in the end, it's for every participant in the sector to think hard, what can they specifically do? And this is where I come back to speaking about my own company, using the scale of the platform to contribute to that shift on both sides, on the traveler side and on the side of our business partners.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. I have one question on the topic of data privacy. I think Peter already talked a little bit about all the care that is needed on that side, and especially with the short-term rental project. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything else on ownership, because typically when we're talking about data, it's someone's data. And we have one participant that says, I'm not comfortable with my data being used. So has anyone to add anything on this topic? I think Peter already touched them very well. But
yeah, very briefly, I think that there's obviously the privacy rules in Europe and in other parts of the world in the GDPR. So sharing personal data, there are very clear constraints, and for absolutely good reasons. I think things can be aggregate, but I'm actually grateful for that question, because it shows it's not that simple, and we need to look at it from all angles.
Thank you. Now a question to I think it's Stefan that mentioned this. On the Amsterdam KPIs, what criteria were used to determine the 20 million tourists as the maximum and the 10 million as unsustainable?
Yeah, it's an interesting process. Actually, in the case of Amsterdam, it was decided by politicians, so by the city government. But the reason why they actually discussed the topic at all was because of a petition that was signed by 30,000 inhabitants from the city of Amsterdam. And I think that's really interesting to know, that it was actually a societal or civic initiative to have the topic of tourism, and especially over tourism and the benefits of tourism, on the political agenda. Then it became part of the political discussion, and at some point these numbers were chosen based on what exactly and what arguments. I think we have to dive into the minutes of those meetings. Basically, it's a number that of course relates to the numbers in the past, and a kind of a sense, I'm not sure, maybe subjective sense or political sense of this is too much and this is too little. How these numbers were exactly chosen, I think we have to consult our colleagues from the city of Amsterdam. But it's interesting how this actually originated from a societal initiative. So there's part of the political process, or the decision-making process, that if you have enough signatories, it should be discussed. And then, of course, this was the outcome, maybe slightly unforeseen, and at the same time not unforeseen at all. But it's interesting that it's actually a set number now, and that there are policy consequences to that. And that's, I think, very, very interesting, maybe even a unique situation.
Okay. I think you are also answered there is another question on Mexico applied some kind of policies to improve tourism growth. Today it's the second country in arrivals in international tourism and 9th in receipts. What kind of tourism data need to consider in order to improve local development? Who wants to jump in? I think we can also be more open, which is it's only arrivals and receipts that should be the data that we should be looking for, or should we consider any other indicator? I don't know who wants to jump in. Ede.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think we have come together with our tourism stakeholders and created tourism strategy for years 22 to 25. And there we had this big discussions about this, is what do we want to achieve? Do we want to achieve the same number of travelers as we had in 2019? Is that the only goal that we want to have, or the number or like billions of exports? And we decided that it is not the only thing that we want to achieve. That of course we want to bring back the revenue from tourism sector to the pre-pandemic level, but to do it in more smarter way. So we want to attract visitors who will come here, stay longer, not only like one-day cruise, but they want to stay longer. They really want to explore different destinations. They are willing to spend for these special events, not only or special services, not only spend their money on big supermarkets. So this is, and also only the people who value our local environment and communities. And I know that this is actually dream of many other countries as well. And we also see that that there are many travelers who are actually demanding this more sustainable and smarter and more local product. So I really hope that that we are moving there. Of course, after this year, after this summer's revenge travel, which was I think basically still, I want to have a son and I want to have that I didn't have for 2 years. But we also see a different trend. And I think now I can jump back to this conferences question, is that I really believe that when people come together from different levels and different backgrounds and discuss things together, then this is the only way to move forward to better industry. And this is also the thing that we want to have here on national level, that we want to have on national level and on destinations levels, this private-public partnerships where all the stakeholders come together and we decide things as much as possible collectively, so that the communities would be also would see their benefits of tourism, and then they can also be offer much more better service to visitors because they are welcoming them.
Thank you. We are reaching the end of our panel, but I have one question. I think I wouldn't forgive myself if I wouldn't do it, and it's a tricky one. How well are we prepared to face a new wave of pandemic, and what's the role of data in having us ready for that? It's 30 seconds, yes or no. Are we ready? Are we more ready than we were before COVID? Because I think it's also a metric. I don't know who wants to jump in. Steph?
30 seconds. That's I think definitely we because it's quite of course a recent experience that we have. I think we're in that sense slightly more ready, but it really depends on the type of health crisis. We'll see if there's another type of virus that requires a different approach. I think we're back at square one.
Thank you, Stefan. Peter?
Yeah, I would very much hope that we take the learnings from it. But with Stefan, I also have some doubt whether we all jump back into action. I would also add maybe on the side of citizens, of people, the willingness to go through another hard wave of lockdowns if we were to get to another pandemic situation, I think is also an important point to discuss. I think in the end, this is primarily probably a question for government. So I truly hope we have learnings. There's a ton of learnings. We probably, like after a project, we need to sit down and consciously make the effort to document those learnings. And I'm not sure this is happening in all parts of the sector.
Thank you. Ede?
Yeah, well, I also would like to hope that we are more ready, not of course fully. Even just to bring some examples, the EU digital travel certificate, etc., that have been worked out. And I think also still we have the contact, so who to turn to and how to discuss things. But I think I would also come to this mindset of people. I think maybe the governments and this public sector or decision makers are more ready now than would the private people be because I think they are not ready to give their rights away so easily as it was.
Thank you. Well, this ends this panel. Thank you very much. It's been truly a privilege to have this discussion with you. And now I'll hand over to Jane Stacy for closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you, Peter, Stefan, Ede. I think that was really interesting. And I think we've gone a little bit over time, but the discussion was so good, and I think we had so many questions. It was certainly worthwhile doing that. I have the pleasure of wrapping up the webinar, so I will be brief. But today we've heard from different speakers highlighting the ongoing challenges and the uncertain outlook facing the sector. But one point I take from the discussion, I think it's the point that we just finished the panel discussion on, is that there is a cautious optimism that tourism can weather this storm and can come out changed, better and stronger. But I think we also heard very clearly the need to translate this hope into action. And this is not just for governments, but it's also for tourism businesses, for destinations, for consumers, also that it needs to be a collective action if we are to achieve this. We know that since the start of the crisis, there's been a lot of focus about using the disruption to really think about the kind of tourism that we want to have in the future, to think about how we go forwards, not backwards. I think it was Stefan who referred to that, and avoid returning to those issues of over-tourism and so forth that were there before the pandemic as we navigate the recovery. But we know we can't be complacent, and it requires big shifts in the tourism model, changes in the behaviour, changes in the practices of businesses, of consumers, of the sector as a whole. And the discussion has also really highlighted, I think another point I would take is the need for, more than ever, for data, for evidence, for analysis on tourism, to measure and monitor progress, to support reforms, insights and data for decision makers. So not just data for the sake of data, but data to inform action. We need to better understand what works and what doesn't work. And take that point in terms of learning the lessons from what works, what doesn't work, benchmarking, learning from other countries, a point that Minister Nash underlined, also to avoid reinventing the wheel and really take that action we need if we are to shift to more sustainable forms of tourism. These are all issues that we're working on at the OECD through the Tourism Committee, through the Working Party on Tourism Statistics, and the report that we're launching today, OECD Tourism Trends and Policies 2022. This very much responds to this demand, bringing data, bringing evidence, bringing analysis, and bringing examples of practices and recommendations of what more can we do to support recovery, to build resilience, to become more sustainable as a sector. And within the report, there are dedicated chapters on these issues. There's a dedicated chapter on resilience and another in particular on promoting a green recovery. We also, within the report, have country profiles for 50 OECD and partner countries. So very much invite you to visit the OECD website where you can read the report, you can access the data. I know there's been some comments in the chat in terms of what data can be accessed. So you can find the data from our report on the OECD's website. You'll also find additional information on our website, including links to the executive summary, which will be available in 11 languages. Again, noting that we have people from around the world on this webinar. So we have the executive summary in French, Estonian, German, Italian, Japanese, Korean, Hungarian, Polish, Portuguese, Spanish, Turkish to come, and we very much welcome any other countries that would like to translate to other languages. You'll find a policy highlights document, podcast, blog also on our website. And you may have noticed in the corner my colleague Francois, who throughout the discussion has been busy scribing a graphic to capture the discussion. So that will be something that we will share after the webinar, and we'll also post the recording of the webinar, again coming back to some of the questions and comments that we have had in the chat. But I think that brings us to the end of the session. Thank you very much to all our speakers. Thank you to Lamia, to Hubert, to Minister Nash, also Sergio for moderating the discussion, and to Ede, Stefan, and Peter for sharing your experiences, your insights, which are very valuable as we move into the next stage of the tourism recovery. And if you're interested, as I say, to find out more about the OECD's work on tourism, again, I invite you to visit our website and to follow us on Twitter at OECD Local. So thank you very much.